Hello U.S. history students, welcome. Today we have lesson 9.7. This is a great high school history lesson topic. Alright, President Lyndon Johnson, the Great Society programs. Now you may know something about these, most of you probably don't, and that's okay. It's a perfect example of whether you know this history or have been interested in this history in the past. This history is interested in you because it is very much in the process of shaping our contemporary political and civic life. This is a great high school lesson because it's not a simple story. All right, there's a lot of shading and complexity and nuance to this. When we use our storyline of the blessing and the curse, this is a lesson where really it gives you a lot that you can pull out and examine and consider with that, because it is definitely both. So let's meet Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson became president in awful circumstances, right? Following the death of John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson takes the oath of office. And Lyndon Johnson and Kennedy had not been especially close friends. They had been paired together by the Democratic Party because their strengths and weaknesses kind of mirrored each other in a way. Like Johnson had a lot of political experience where Kennedy didn't. Johnson had a touch with rural folks and southern folks the way that Kennedy, who's kind of a northeastern blue blood, didn't. Lyndon Johnson had been in Washington, D.C. for decades, right? He knew how the sausage got made. He knew how deals got passed. He knew how bills got passed and deals got done. He is an ambitious son of a gun, right? I mean, for him, even to accept the role of vice president, he didn't want that job. He wanted the presidency. He craved it. And not only did he want the presidency, Lyndon Johnson wanted to be like a Mount Rushmore president, right? I mean, when he came to Washington, D.C., he came during the New Deal years with FDR. And FDR is his political model, his political hero. And so Lyndon Johnson, in certain ways, models himself after that. Definitely in the sense of like, we're gonna take this political machine and I'm gonna make it move. I'm gonna make it hum. And we are going to try all kinds of different stuff, right? Like one of the things he used to say a lot to people is like, there's all kinds of things I'm for and there ain't many things I'm against, right? Like I want to make stuff happen in Washington, D.C. And he felt like, I've been a creature of Washington, D.C. I know every building, I know every person, I know every person's secretary, I know every person's mother-in-law, like I know how to sweet talk people and I know how to twist arms and twist elbows. Like I know how to get stuff done in this town in the way that like cool, smooth talking JFK can't do. And so Lyndon Johnson was going to sort of be Kennedy's pit bull, behind the scenes pit bull. And suddenly he's thrust into the presidency in his own right. And he will, especially in the first couple years of his presidency, he develops a real reputation of being able to get things done, right? That kind of get her done mentality is absolutely a Lyndon Johnson trademark. And it's sort of, I'll say, it's kind of funny the way he can do this. Like Lyndon Johnson, he is a skilled politician because he knows how to control people's fear of him and their love of him. Right? It's like Machiavelli. He just knows how to control and manipulate people. He could overpower people by just getting in their space, like you can see here. And sometimes, like the picture in the center, he's there talking and he's like, this is a threatening thing, but sometimes he would get in a person's space even with a big smile on their face, just as a way of like making people uncomfortable. He would do this with his own staff. He would do this with journalists. He had this sort of shameless way of like, I'm always the most comfortable one in the room because I'm the president and you're not. And so I'm going to make you uncomfortable by getting in your space or by having meetings or confrontations with you in ways that make you uncomfortable. Like he would have meetings with people, he'd want to talk about legislative bills while he was taking a bath and like tell these people to come in and meet with him, and he'd just be sitting there naked in the bathtub or swimming in the pool naked. Or he would go on walks with people and he would just sort of like, stop by a tree and start going to the bathroom as he's talking with them, and it would be a number one or sometimes a number two. Like this is a real thing that would happen, and it was the response of everybody else is always like, this is so weird. But to Johnson, it wasn't weird at all. It was just like This is how you move people off their spot and get them to come with you. And all of Kennedy's smooth talk actually can't do that. And some politicians like to think it's all like hope and inspirational talk. No, you know how politics is done? Like, you have the power, and you use that power to get people to do something that you need them to do. So what did he get done with this? I'll say, I want to say this, for all students who are like, well, I don't think a president should do stuff like that, or I don't think a president should act like this. I'll say, if you like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, those key pieces of civil rights legislation as part of the civil rights movement, you don't get those without Lyndon Johnson twisting arms. All right? Kennedy offered his support for this, but it was a somewhat passive support. And I hope we can make this happen. But frankly, there was a lot of people in the Senate and the House of Representatives who looked at Kennedy like, yeah, I don't know if you can, I'm not sure I'm going to do that for you, right? Johnson had this way of Johnson, through sheer political skill and in some ways through sheer political brute force, pushed those key pieces of legislation through Congress. In some ways, Lyndon Johnson used guilt trips to make this happen. Right after Kennedy dies, Johnson starts giving speeches where he says things like, no memorial oration or eulogy could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill for which he fought for so long. I mean, that's a stretch. Kennedy was not necessarily a civil rights warrior, but frankly, Johnson was. Johnson did want this. Johnson, in some ways, he looked like a good old boy from Texas, but his heart was with the civil rights movement, and he becomes president, and he throws his shoulder behind those efforts. To his credit, I would argue. Then he's like, now we're going to go even bigger, right? He announces a proposal that he calls the Great Society, right? And it is the most ambitious legislative proposal that anyone has had ever offered since FDR. I mean, nothing's ever as big as FDR and the New Deal. This is very close, and certainly there's been nothing like it since. And in the Great Society, Lyndon Johnson says, I don't see the Great Society programs, these set of laws, as we're going to rearrange some furniture here, right? Or we're going to sort of rearrange little pieces or introduce a couple nice nifty laws that I think might be useful. He's like, no, let's reimagine America, right? Let's reimagine our vision of justice and what is right and what government can do, what government can provide. And I believe he's going to say that government can and should do so much more than it has done in the past. We are so gifted. We have been given so much in America. Now let's make a great society here in America, right? Let's bring everybody in and make sure there's a place for everybody at the table. That's the pitch he's going to try to make. He gives a famous speech as he's kind of laying out this pitch for what government can do. And he addresses in this certain notions of merit. And I think this is really good and worth considering for a moment, right? Because he's going to say, in the United States, we believe in equal opportunity. Everybody should have the same kind of opportunity to succeed or to fail. And he's like, I agree, but let's add to that. He said, you do not take a person who for years has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bring him up to the starting line of a race, and then say, you are free to compete with all the others and still justly believe that you've been completely fair. Right? He says, you do not have a system of Jim Crow segregation in place for generations after there's been generations and even more generations of slavery, and then set these people, right, set African Americans, poor African Americans, at the starting line of a 100-meter race and say, cool, now you get to compete just like everybody else. And it's like, you know what, their situation is not just like everybody else. All right? This is not a completely fair situation when you've literally just ended Jim Crow segregation and that manifest injustice. And government can do more. Government ought to do more. And when he starts elaborating, well, what do you mean? What more should the government do? He says, I think government should target and work to alleviate the hunger for community in America, right? Government can provide more community and more connection between Americans. Government can enhance the meaning of our lives. Government can end the restlessness that comes from professional ambition being thwarted, right? It can end that restlessness that leads people down negative paths. And I just want to pause before we get into this and ask you, what do you think of those goals, students? Does that make you lean in and say, yes, that is so much more than the old idea of government should just protect our liberties? Or does this notion cause you to say, I don't know, like if people start saying government should do this, I'm worried, A, that government can't do it, or that when government fails to do it, that people are going to become even more desperate or frustrated or angry, or that like what will be the costs of trying to do these things as well? What is the proper role for government? What does the good life in America require our government to do? Lyndon Johnson is going to say more, a lot more. I'm going to ask you today, what do you think of this? Let's look at some specific examples. So what do I mean by Great Society programs? Some of the names are familiar, all right? Medicare and Medicaid. These are probably terms you've heard before. Certainly you might have heard parents talk about them, politicians talk about them all the time, all right? Basically, Medicare and Medicaid, you can think of them as expansions of Social Security, right? Social Security was the granddaddy of all entitlement programs or welfare-style programs. Medicare says, well, the elderly should get not only that pension, that retirement money, but the government should provide health insurance for them as well, all right? So Medicare is passed as part of this Great Society package of programs because elderly people have more medical needs, and private insurance would charge elderly people too much money, perhaps, or so goes the argument, or there's too many elderly people who don't have health insurance, and then when they have health needs and they have crazy costs and bankruptcy concerns and blah, blah, blah. So the government should provide health insurance for the elderly as well. Medicaid says, well, let's use this whole mechanism of Social Security and Medicare, and let's expand it to offer health insurance and medical services for people below the poverty line. All right, so now it's not just the elderly or widows or disabled. Now it's elderly, widows, disabled, and the poor. By the way, Medicare. People debate this notion of today doing Medicare for all. Should we just get rid of all private health insurance companies and health insurance in the United States and just switch to the whole country is on a government system like Medicare? Head Start is a system that says we can help the poor by having government subsidized or government paid for preschool for the children of the poor. It's not the fault of the children of the poor that they're poor. And study after study shows that that the discrepancies or the differences between success in school and failure in school isn't as much really measured by, as weird as this might sound to you, by what happens when you're 14, 15, 16 years old. The real gaps tend to get created back when you're 3, 4, 5, and 6 years old, right? And the difference between kids that can show up and at the end of kindergarten they are reading and doing simple arithmetic and kids that are still struggling to identify their letters, right? So maybe we can do a Head Start program and get more kids into schools, all right, into preschools. Or we'll start public broadcasting. That's another Great Society program. PBS. And we'll put programming on PBS like Sesame Street to teach little kids who might just be at home, right? Urban kids, whatever, poor kids who are sitting at home. Let's put people on the screen who look like them and let's teach them their ABCs that way. Food stamps, right? Help the poor to pay for their own groceries. And the idea of food stamps is you can't just buy all kinds of nonsense with them. You can buy sort of appropriate and nutritious food with the food stamps, and so these would be issued by the government and you use them almost like ration coupons, and then you get all this stuff. All right, and the civil rights laws we would also put in this category of the Great Society laws. Basically, we're going to make a society that is more inclusive, that has a broader safety net for everybody, where more people are invited to the table, and we're helping more people to have a real fair shot in that race. What do you think so far, students? Are you nodding your heads to this? Are you encouraged that the government is doing this? Is there some antenna in the back of your head saying, yeah, but what are the costs? Or yeah, but what are the concerns here? Does it work? Well, it's complicated. It depends on when you're looking at. I'd say it's pretty hard to argue that the Great Society did not have positive effects in the short term, short and intermediate term, right? Those benefits seem fairly clear. So to give you a statistical, I want to look at numbers here. I don't want to argue, character development in the country. Let's look at numbers for a second here. So in 1960, just over a fifth of Americans, 22% of Americans, live below the poverty line. By 1970, that figure is 12%. All right? So certainly that is like a rising economy is helping, but the Great Society programs are having an effect, and ending segregation is having a positive effect, and this is really good. And it is absolutely true that there are more people who were, I guess, outside the system before, who were taken care of, or their level of of security in life was improved as a result of the Great Society. Since the 1970s, the poverty line and the poverty level has fluctuated, but not trended down. The poverty rate in the United States has held more or less steady since the 1970s. During that time, the United States government has spent some $17 trillion on Great Society programs. So an immense amount of money, taxpayer money, has been spent on this, and we see increasingly diminished returns. All right? A feature of the Great Society programs, it's not like a bug of this, a feature of the Great Society programs is more and more people are receiving entitlement money or entitlement benefits from the government, right? I mean, it's offering more of them, so more people are receiving that. What has certainly happened is that as there's more hands up to receive this, when some hands up mean that more people's hands go up, and there's a lot more people trying to receive these benefits, and there are more people who are also dependent on the government. A greater percentage of Americans don't work or even attempt to work today than what happened in the 1950s and 60s before the Great Society programs. That's a challenge or a cost built into this. I think it's fair to say that when the government spends a bunch of money, the government is able to deliver on big material things, right? Like you build the Tennessee Valley Authority, the government can deliver on that, right? You build the Eisenhower Interstate System, the government can deliver on a big tangible concrete thing like this. The Works Progress Administration, we can build city halls and dams and schools left and right. Can we deliver on like satisfying the need for community and satisfying the need for meaning in life? I'd say, oh man, that's a harder thing for government to deliver on. Before the Great Society, about 1/4 of all the money that the federal government spent, 24%, was spent on welfare and social programs, primarily Social Security. Right? Today, it's not 1/4. Today, it's 60%. Right? Is spent on welfare spending. And when you look at this sort of chart that lays it out, you can see a key point. All those colors that are sort of brown and yellow and tan, those earth tones, those are what you would call, I guess, welfare state spending. And you can see that key moment right around 1965, the start of the Great Society programs, where those really begin to balloon. Right? That is the big shift and the big change. Does the meaning of the good life in America mean that it's government's role to step in and make sure that there is a safety net like was created here, and that this many people are assured a place at the table? Is that the meaning of the good life? At all costs? What is the purpose for government in American life? How is this vision different from what the founders said? Whose vision do you prefer, ladies and gentlemen? Would we do better as Americans, as people, to make more modest demands of government? To stop saying to government that like the government must be the thing that fixes all these things that we see? And if there's a problem that we need the federal government to do more to step in? Right? Or at the very least, if you say, no, I think the government should do more about that, and that is my biggest concern in the 2020 presidential election, I'd say, are you comfortable with the costs? There's no good answer here, guys. This is a complex one. There's blessings and curses here. I hope you got to see that today. I hope your understanding of these questions was deepened today, and I look forward to seeing some of your responses. Thanks so much, everybody. You guys have a great day.